honored and privileged to have Professor Zaman Stanizai. Dr. Stanizai is a professor of mythological studies at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California, and he teaches political science at California State University. He has a doctorate in political science from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Washington in Seattle. As a Fulbright scholar, he has worked in Indo-Iranian languages, and his postdoctoral studies have been in Islamic mysticism and depth and sacred psychology. So today he will be talking on towards an alchemical transformation. This is our third lecture in this in Dialogue online series, and we look forward to your questions and active participation. The talk will be for about an hour, and then we will have a questions and answers session for about half an hour. So you can write your questions in the chat box, and I will read them to Dr. Zaman if he is also okay with it. So over to you, Dr. Zaman. And welcome to In Dialogue Foundation's online platform.
Thank you for the invitation, and I appreciate it. Without further ado, I think let's get to the topic, because we will be, we might be running short of time. Usually when I talk, I mess up on the break system. So you do remind me when I need to stop, but you said an hour. I think an hour should be good enough.
Yes.
Let me start the talk with a quotation in the poem form from Maulana Jalaluddin Balkhi Rumi that everybody knows. I hope everybody does. You're not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I am changing myself. And I think we should concentrate on that last line. Today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself. So the talk is going to be in a sense about Ramadan, but it's more about how to change yourself in Ramadan. To kind of share the relevance of Ramadan with you, the etymology is that this month used to be called the month of Natak before the Islamic period, which meant burning, or the starter for setting fire, Natak. And that's, for those of you who speak Arabic, it's not spelled with the ta, but with the ta, the first T. Then came the next word for the month, which is called Ramazan, which comes from Raml or Rama or Ramza, which means stone. And here references to the stones heated by the hot summer sun. Both of those references tell us that the month of Ramadan used to be always in the summer, when the calendar was not rotating. And the rotation of the calendar began during the Islamic period. That's a whole other story. But when we look at it from a religious perspective, Ramadan has to be a month of hardship, a hardship that you impose on yourself. It shows your dependency on the nature. So you deny yourself all the pleasures, or as many of the pleasures in life that you can. What this does is that it makes you aware of the interconnectedness of nature, of which we humans are a part. And we often put ourselves separate from nature, independent from nature, and in a way, in addition to getting arrogant, we just forget the duty that is upon us as Muslims, as the custodians of the earth, of the environment. There's also another element in here, which is that in many religions, part of their rites and rituals make use of the four basic elements. Traditionally, the earth, water, air, and fire. And each one of these is used as an element for cleansing, for making you clean, for purifying you. The idea here is that you would have to cleanse yourself from all the impurities. So we don't need to go through the details, and I'm sure that you can make reference to almost any religious tradition that the four elements are present in one way or another for the purpose of cleansing. That being so, especially in reference to the fire, there is the issue of, or the angle of Islamic mysticism, Sufism, where those same concepts that I suggested about the hardship in Ramadan, the burning heat and the stones and all of that, and the analogies that the Sufis make is that we humans are like a piece of iron that needs to be hammered into shape. You can't hammer it into shape unless it's heated. And it's heated in order for the impurities to fall off of it. And so therefore, a rusty iron ore will only become a beautiful, shining, let's say, object as a sword or some such a thing, only if it goes through those stages of being heated, burned, hammered, and shaped. So the Sufis then again pray that, oh God, help me burn my impurities so I can come out clean. Here we can see that that example, particular example that is more visible is one of an iron ore or a piece of iron. But when you look at metals in general, there are some metals that you'll have to put in fire and heat them and hammer them into shape. But there are other metals that by nature are so pure and so clean that they do not accept impurities. They reject impurities by nature. One such metal is gold. Gold doesn't rust. It doesn't oxidize. It doesn't accept other metals with it. And so the purity of gold is its nature, and that is its beauty. And the understanding is that we humans were born to be gold, to be pure, to be angelic, to be innocent, any of these terms that you feel comfortable with. But then we somehow allowed ourselves to be rusted. And in order for us to go back, to reverse that trend, to cleanse ourselves, to become pure gold again, we will have to go through a certain process. And in that process, we need to go through a change, through a transformation. And that transformation is what we sometimes call the alchemical transformation. And that's why the talk is towards an alchemical transformation. So yes, we can use the month of Ramadan as an opportunity to change ourselves. But how do we change? It would have to be different. Most often people think of Ramadan as not eating, fasting from food. Well, that might cleanse your physical body form. But we humans are more than just the physical. We are more than just the body. How do we cleanse our soul, for instance? And it's in that context that we have to understand that while we were born as gold, in the process, we attracted a lot of impurities by trying to earn and gain and make things our own. And in the process, we became something like copper, that is less than gold. And so oftentimes we're unaware of this change. We have forgotten our original gold nature. So we are too busy living and enjoying ourselves as copper, not knowing our true potentials. And that's why the question that comes to mind is then, yes, you need to have an awareness. You have to know that you have become less than what you were intended to be. And then you have to strive for becoming better, for becoming gold. Now, how do we know this as a way of going about it? The Quran is telling us, just like many other scriptural books, and many stories in reference. And oftentimes, because these stories are old, we equate them with old stories, which is often an understanding of history. So we think of them historical. But in the process, we forget the allegorical and the metaphorical significance of these stories. And that's what matters much more than the historical one. And so in that context, like in the olden times when people wanted to turn back into gold, they will have to go through a certain process. And for that process, they had to go to a certain place, to a state. So one of the key words that people usually talk about is, the key places rather, is Egypt. The word Aiguptos, which is a Greek word derived from the Egyptian word Hikupta, which translates as home of the soul. You see, there is a lot of spirituality in that concept. So we're not talking about geography. The Akkadian word for Egypt was Misru, from which we get to the word Misr in Arabic, or as the Egyptians would say, Masr. But there is a more important name of Egypt, and that is that in the ancient Egyptian, the country's name was Kemet. And when the Egyptian language was in the Coptic phase, the name was slightly altered to Kemi, and then it came to Greek and it was pronounced as Kimia. And the Kimia was Arabized into Alchemia. And then it was Latinized back into alchemy. So the word alchemy is a name for Egypt, not necessarily the geographic one, and of course that is part of it. But the significance is that when people had to go to Egypt, they had to go to Egypt to go through a process. And transformation is that process. They wanted to turn their copper into gold. And in this sense, we have two stories in the Quran, and there are similar ones in other religious traditions too. One is the story of Joseph, who went to Egypt, and the other one is of Moses. Most people would think of those as beautiful stories, nice narratives. Yes, that is so. However, most of the significance of, if we just take these two stories, is in the allegorical. Most of the significance, I'm repeating, most of the significance of the stories is in the allegories through which we go for both of those. Let's take the story of Joseph, for example. He was a young man who was dropped in a dark well. That's darkness. He was dropped down. That is kind of collapsing or separating or getting away from light. Then he is taken out from that darkness, and he rises to eventually become a high-ranking official in the Egyptian, in the Pharaoh's palace. So how does one get from the depth of a well to the height in palace? And those are the transformations that the story of Joseph is telling us, that he had to find his true self. He was thrown in the well because his brothers were jealous. Then he goes and he's sold as a slave, which means he was enslaved to other values, wealth or whatever it was. Then he is tempted by the wife of Potiphar, Zulaikha. So he had to resist the sexual temptation. And then he was accused of one or another thing and thrown back into jail. And in due course, he proved that that's not what he was. And his being in jail, in a way, reminds us of a particular story, in modern American literature, where Emerson goes to visit David Thoreau, who was put in jail, and Emerson says, that's for those of you who are interested in literature. So Emerson says to Thoreau, who was a great scholar, and yet he was in prison, so he tells him, David, what are you doing in there? Sarcastically. And David responds from inside the jail and says to Emerson, and what are you doing out there? Implying that you don't belong out there because the world is so dirty, it's so corrupt. The jail is at least clean. Now, take that analogy and put it on the story of Joseph. And so Joseph was put in jail partly because the world was so corrupt. And only when the world cleansed itself, when they realized that Joseph was telling the truth all the time, that he had been the right man, only then Joseph comes out. The other story is of Moses. And Joseph goes to Egypt to cleanse himself as a young man. Moses goes there as a more mature, as an older man. But I think it's important to know who Moses was then. Let me tell you the story of Moses, and if you have heard it different, let me know. That there was the sun god who assured a beautiful young girl that if she became his companion, the companion of the sun god, that their union would be immaculate. And this beautiful woman's name was Kunti. And Kunti is telling the sun god that she has not been touched by a man, and she would rather he not. One thing leads to another, and the sun god and Kunti get together, and she becomes pregnant with an illegitimate child who would cause the downfall of an empire. So the sun god is telling Kunti that you should get rid of this child. and she is hesitant. But then she doesn't have much of a choice. You know, she's talking to the sun god. So yes, she does all the crying and wailing and weeping and all that, but she puts the child in a wicker basket and puts that into the Asvanandi river, which is a tributary of the legendary divine river, the goddess Ganga. And Ganga embraces the child, and that becomes, in a way, his mother. And so the child is Karna. Have you heard a story like this somewhere else? This is from the Hindu tradition. But if you tweak it a little bit and change the names a little bit, it's the exact same story as that of Moses, and part of it is similar to that of the birth of Jesus. So how could it be that the Hindu tradition, the Christian tradition, and the Hebrew Judaic tradition, and in a way, Quran's references also to a story that is pretty much one and the same, and you wonder, how did it replicate? And that's exactly where my point is, that the scriptures are more interested in telling the truth rather than explaining a historical record. So they are not books of history, but rather the allegories are used to allow people to learn how to purify themselves. So going back to the story of Moses, then, we can superimpose that. Moses' mother would be Jochebed, which will be the equivalent of Kunti. Karna will be Moses. The Ganga River will be the Nile, and they are taken to the king in India. The other one will be taken to the king in Egypt. And in both stories, the significance of the sun god, Ain Shams in Egypt, would be as significant or similarly significant, the worship of the sun as part of nature and all that. So you see the similarities are great, and that is because when it comes to the absolute truth, there's not that much of a difference. So when Moses goes to Egypt, now again, go back to the etymology, Egypt was supposed to be the alchemy. That is the chemical laboratory where you fixed yourself. So Moses, who has already been tested, remember the 4 elements. He was tested by fire when in childhood he burned his tongue. And then he was tested by water when he parted the sea. The falsehood on one side, the truth on the other, and he made his way right through it. And then he was tested by land, the promised land, and we can go on and on like that. He was promised also by air, which makes Moses the only prophet in the monotheistic traditions who heard God speak. And so Moses goes through these tests, but if that is the case, that Moses is representing an allegory, how do we understand that, or understand in the sense, in a practical sense? The way I would look at it is that we have to forget Moses as either a historical or scriptural personality. Each one of us can be Moses. Each one of us can go through the same test. And we can learn from all the problems in the world, that not that the world is a wonderful place. Just if you look at the lotus flower, it grows in dirt and sludge. So it comes from dark dirt, sludge at the bottom of a pond, a lake, and then on top it comes a beautiful flower. So we define things in opposites. To every good, there is a bad. Good doesn't exist unless it's contrasted with the bad. So you can complain all you want, but the world has a lot of bad things in it. Your job and your choice is whether you want to become part of the bad things in the world or part of the good things in the world. And that's where you will have to go through this test, especially in Ramadan. And in that case, it's denying yourselves not just the pleasures, that's one thing, but going farther than that, in purifying yourselves and in trying to, like I said earlier, to purify your soul, not just your physical system. And in that, you would have to, in cleaning the soul and cleansing it, you would have to clean your mind. And the way to clean your mind is also to clean your perception. And your perception can be cleaned from a particular angle when you look at your own life history. If you remember when you were 3 or 4 years old, you asked a question. All of us do. And it's never answered to our satisfaction. What is that question? The question is, we tell usually our mother or sometimes the father, "Mommy, where do I come from?" And yes, they tell us all kinds of stories to distract us, in a way to deny us the real answer. For one, maybe they don't know themselves. But if you haven't figured out that the question that you asked at the age of 4, and like I said, in most cases, it's not answered to the satisfaction of everyone. So if you are, say, at age of 40, we'll just put a 0 there, hypothetically, so don't feel bad if you're younger, I mean inexperienced. So if you haven't figured out where you have come from, then how do you know where you're going? Those two questions have to be responded together. And if you don't know where you're going, then you live only in the present. And in a way, you have arrived where you're supposed to be. But then you think about your potentials. Did your potential suggest that you should be where you are? What do you have? And as I said earlier, that if you haven't purified your soul, then you have covered yourself with a lot of things. And what are those coverings? And those coverings are that you have become part of the accidentals. Now I'm using a philosophical term. The difference between accidental and essential is that the essential is there because it ought to be there. It is your beingness that is essential. Accidentals are things that you gather. They are temporary. They are here now and then they're not there tomorrow in that sense. That when we gather and collect the accidentals, the temporals, the material things, the perception you generally have is like you own them, that they belong to you. But after a while, you realize, if you wake up, if you have an awareness, that no, they don't belong to you in reality. You have been owned by them, that you belong to them. If you define yourself in terms of your wealth, in terms of your position, in terms of your money, status, power, all these things are things that would define you in a way that, for instance, your wealth is nothing but greed. Your prestige is your ego. Your fame is detachment from the ordinary people. You're caring for the family. You think that's a virtue. It's simply an animal instinct for survival. And so you have gathered all these things, and in the process, you have covered your very essential being, your angelic being, your gold is hidden underneath. And all the impurities that have been attached to it, it had turned into something like a copper. And in some cases, it might not even be that. In the case of some people, they might be simply like, iron ore, rusty, broken, bent, and all that. So when you have that realization, if you're lucky at some point in your life, that you try to answer that question when you're 4 years old, and you answer it to a degree of satisfaction that would at least make you curious if you haven't really answered it fully. And so that's when you make that cleansing effort, the cleansing of the perception, then we have to think about it more in the sense of, again, those possessions, those coverings. And in many cases, before you have an awareness, you're thinking of yourself more as the center of the universe. You are it. You are the universe. And if all these things belong to you and the belonging defines who you are, now imagine what happens. When you die, they die with you. Because you're temporal, and so are they, temporal and accidental. But then you had forgotten that you have that eternal component. And so if you emphasize your temporal, you become temporal. If you become aware of your eternal self, then you can become eternal. But it takes an effort. It takes that effort of going to Egypt. It takes an effort of having that alchemical transformation, that change. And like I said, if you have not looked at that, and if you're not aware, and if you think the whole world will be defined by things you own, in that case, you're not just atemporal, but you're already dead. You're looking at the expiration date, like in a bottle of medication, and all you're waiting for is the actual moment at which the ingredients of that medicine no longer work for what they were intended to. In essence, you're a dead man walking, or dead women. In becoming temporal, then you have made everything that was yours temporal, including your God, your religion, and the rest of it. Now, the alternative is to turn yourself to gold and turn the copper self into a gold. And for those, you have to be wanting it. There's the need, the desire, just not the awareness. And the first thing is that you become aware that you're not a gold and you could be. The second one is you take steps towards that. Now, remember, when we stick to the concept of the allegory of the gold, gold can be cleaned by washing. It could be cleaned by washing, maybe, but it could be cleaned more if you burn it in fire, if you melt it, and all the impurities come to the surface. Most of us, when we think about gold, let me stick to this allegory part of this, we think of gold when we see it in a jewelry store. That is not gold. And the jeweler will tell you it's 14 karat, 18 karat, whatever. Simply, they are making that confession that it's not pure gold. So you see jewelry, you see shapes that pleases your senses. You see forms. You see jewelry, but you don't see gold. If you want to see gold, you have to go to a goldsmith shop. That's where golden nuggets are smelted. And that's where the issue of metallurgy comes in, where molten gold is turned into an ingot. And when you see the beauty of melted gold, it's astonishing. it shines there. It has brilliance to it. Because it was the purity of it is such that all the impurities have burned, and gold doesn't burn. And so, using that analogy, then you have to start putting yourself through that, thinking that that your essence is, in a sense, a chip, like a computer chip in a motherboard, and that is your brain. It's your intellect, the headquarters of your reasoning. In there is a screen, a veil, if you will. So long as you see the veil, you won't see what's beyond the veil. You won't see the truth. Now, what is the veil? That is the veil of perception. And where does perception come from? It comes from the power of imagination. Do we need imagination? We can't do without it. Of course we do. It even precedes our thinking. That's how necessary imagination is. The problem is that it not only precedes our thinking, but it lingers on afterwards. And it's in this lingering that a certain thickness is created, a veil is created. It turns into a curtain, into a drape, into a wall, into a mountain. Yeah, the more you feed on that reality of the perception, the thicker it becomes, so the truth is hidden beyond that. So how do you make the mountain disappear? To see what is on the other side, to see what the truth is. One way is to become Moses, in case you forgot you were Moses, right? So what did you do when you were Moses? Well, you thought that Moses was some guy who was lost in the Sinai for 40 years because he didn't have a GPS, right? That is the story. That's the anecdote. Not so. You are Moses. You have been left afloat on the water. The Nile, Ganga, doesn't matter. Okay, let me cut short through the analogy part of it here. You went through all these processes of purification. It got to a point where you, Moses, who went to that mountain, you had the guts, you had the courage, and you felt that you deserved to ask a question, a very critical question. After God had talked to you many times, now you make one more demand of God. And that demand is, oh God, show me thyself. And what does God say? You can't see me. If you doubt it, look at the mountain. And the mountain catches fire. It burns. And Moses faints and falls and understands. What this means is that that the thick wall of perception has been at least weakened, if not burned down completely. But also that Moses becomes aware that that he may not be equipped in terms of his senses to know, or to see, rather, to see God. Now, in this regard, then when you become Moses, you have to go through your alchemical process. That is the cleaning of your perception. And I can give you some examples. I hope I'm not offending anyone. Some of the perceptions we have is that because we, for the most part, are worshiping a God of many thousand years ago. we have become too smart and too intelligent and too educated and too bright. And yet, in the process, we have forgotten that the allegories are historical, and we feel like, well, then we must stick to that. Otherwise, we feel guilty or even sinful. If you want to clean your perception, for instance, become aware of how you see God. You gave God a name. God doesn't have one. God told Moses, I am who I am. Was there a name? There wasn't. In the Quran, God is referred to what? As Allah. Separate the two parts. Al is the article. Law is nothing. The nothingness. That's not a name. It simply implies that God is unlike anything you can think of. In other words, to make God separate from the thingness of the material world that we humans are in the habit of perceiving. You gave God personality. God doesn't have it. We often impose our human personalities on God. God gets angry, God is vengeful, God is this and God is that. Those are human attributes. As Muslims, and I'm sure this applies in one way or another to other religious people of other religious traditions as well. If God has 99 names and we name ourselves one of those names, the idea is that we are supposed to take the attributes of God and apply it to ourselves to make ourselves better. Not to take our own perceptions and impose it on God, which is the exact opposite of what Quran is telling us. You gave God an image. God doesn't have an image. Your image of God is a speck of your imagination, perceived by your limited human senses through your life experience. So your perception and your experience are finite. You can't perceive an infinite God through finite means. You assign God actions. God do this, God do that. You even order God in a way through what we often refer to as our prayers. In my opinion, those are not prayers when you're ordering God around to do things, because you initiate an action. God destroyed coronavirus, for instance, as if God is your secretary at your service and you're giving the orders. Prayers in Arabic is dua. Dua is when you invite God into an action that you are taking, not an action that God is taking. Why is God not taking an action? Because he gave us the ability. Remember the story of the Adam in the Garden of Eden? You asked for it. Now remember, you're not only Moses, you're also an Adam. You asked for the freedom of will. You wanted to have a choice. You wanted to make a choice. It's your right to have the right to will something and act upon it. God will help you, yes, but you have to take the action. God doesn't take an action because he has given to us that prerogative. You even own God. Remember the expression, oh my God? We even own, you can't own God. You even give God a religion. Usually, it's your religion, whatever tradition you may follow. And it's because of that, you are denying all the other religions. Whereas God is inviting humanity. Whatever path you take, so long as it leads to God, that is the right religion. But a human religion, not God's religion. Why is that a human religion? Because Religion, the way we deal with it, is basically a social contract, not a divine inspiration. Our religions are a display of a social identity. We are religious because the society demands of us, because the society has made it its business to judge us by our level of religiosity, by our worship, by our rites and rituals, by our ibadah. Whatever we do or we don't, the society is judging us whether we are a good person or a bad person. And therefore, when we respond to the society's demand, we have taken God out of the equation. The Quran is telling us that when we dialogue with God Almighty, the first page of the Quran is to show us the straight path. What is the straight path? That between you and God, there's no intervening agent to come between. Then the path is straight. That is Sirat al-Mustaqim. You, God, and nothing in between. But most of what we do in the name of religion, like I give you the examples, we do it because people demand of us. And so when people demand of us from left and right and are pushing us to one or the other direction, then our path to God is not Sirat al-Mustaqim. We do it because of people. Yet, we call it that the religion of God. We claim it to be God's religion, when in reality it is ours. The Quran is clearly telling us, God is telling us through the Quran, that today I completed your religion for you. Double emphasis, your religion for you. Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum. God didn't say it's my religion. God said it's yours, and yet you claim it to be God's. So in that sense, if we have to make that path very straight, Sirat al-Mustaqim, between you and God and nothing and no one else, and in the process, you try to disown the things that you have collected, that you have gathered, that you have made part of yourself, wealth, power, status, all the things that are worldly, then you have created a very, very thick veil. And that has pushed you to a side where you have become relatively Muslim, relatively Hindu, relatively Christian, whatever that relativity is, which is taking you away from the absolute truth, which would be God's. Now, and in that case, you will have to go through a concept of separating the two things, that God is not relative but absolute. Time is not absolute but relative. And you have the time to go through the process. Process by itself implies time as an element of it, as an element for that process of change. And so if you mean to, and like I told you when cleaning your perception, one of those would be that you do become arrogant in ways that you don't even feel like that is arrogance. For instance, when you claim your religion to be the only true religion, that is your arrogance. If you claim, or when you claim that your understanding of God is the only true understanding, that is your self-centeredness. Can you understand God? Of course not. You can't even sense God because your senses are too weak. Your senses are too worldly. Your sight, your vision, your hearing, all of these, we enhance them constantly using microphones, megaphones, all sorts of equipment, which prove that our senses are incapable of seeing everything. So if you can't employ all your senses effectively, and you know they are not, that they have defects, then there's no way you can understand God. So then the idea is that the understanding of God is not a prerogative. The simple thing is that at least you know, you acknowledge that there is God without necessarily have the knowledge, because the knowledge to know may be way too much for you. So, but our human arrogance wouldn't leave us alone. So often it's, if I can use a metaphor, is that like if you use the bottom of a broken glass bottle and you try to hold it to the space to see if you can observe the galactic spiral, you won't see a thing. It's just a broken bottle, so you have to be careful. Might hurt yourself. So to bring it back to this concept of impurity is that first, cleanse yourself. Your body, physical form, yes, that's one thing, but cleanse your perception. And that way you will get rid of the veils that have come between you and the absolute God, with whatever degree of understanding. Now remember, Rumi is telling us a story, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that when he was headed towards Mount Sinai, he saw a shepherd and he rested against a wall when the shepherd was on the other side of the wall praying to God. And the shepherd was in a dialogue with God, telling him that if God comes to visit the shepherd will serve him the best milk and will take care of the place where he's sitting, and he will get rid of his lice, and very, very vulgar language. And Moses was astounded. So he turns to the shepherd and says, like, whom were you talking to? And the shepherd says, I wasn't talking to anyone but to God. So Moses says, that's not the way to talk to God. God doesn't have lice. God doesn't get hungry. God doesn't need your milk. And he tells him a few more. And then Moses walks away and heads towards Mount Sinai. And God commands him to make a U-turn. He said, you confused one of my most devout human beings. The way he understood, that was the best prayer that I was getting from him. Now you made him so confused, he doesn't know what to do. And so he tells Moses that I sent you to bring me close to my people, to bring the people close to me. I didn't assign you to create separation. You were there to create unions, and you did the wrong thing. Moses goes back, apologizes to the shepherd, and tells him, worship God the way you want. So, yes, within that perception, within the limited knowledge that we have, we can still worship God, but do understand one thing. By simply worshiping God, it does not make you a good human being. Now, I'm not being judgmental, but the point here is that the relationship of the human and the divine is a fact. When you pray and say, I'm praying this because I'm the human and I'm praying to the God, that's only an acknowledgement. If you really want to worship God, in my opinion, my very humble opinion, worship God out of love, not out of obligation. And love has a different language. And sometimes that language is silence.
So are we done with the talk, Dr. Zaman?
I think I said the word silence. It applies only to me, yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for this enlightening talk. We have some questions from our audience too. But before I read them to you, I would like to ask a question myself. Since, I mean, as you said in your talk, that there shouldn't be anything between us and the God. It is just us and the God. There should be no intervention. But at the same time, we know that in all religions, uh, there have been prophets who have been sent to teach the teachings of the God, the message, who have been sent to bring the message of the God. So how do we see that? What should we understand from that? I mean, he is also a messenger, yeah, and he's bringing the message of the God to us. There is
Um,
someone in between God and the
we
people.
Yes, we have two words. One is wahya, one is ilham. Wahya is a kind of inspiration, which is more like a duty and a task and an assignment. And the message is not for one person, it's for the whole humanity. So when Prophet Muhammad received the wahya, it wasn't just for him. And that's why his name hardly appears anywhere in the Quran. But it was for all humanity. So he became a vehicle. And as that vehicle, then he is the Rasul, the messenger. So Wahya has that capacity. And Wahya, as we believe, ended with Prophet Muhammad. That's gone, there's no more. However, Ilham is inspiration. And there's no expiration date for that. It has not ended. And any one of us have the capacity to receive an inspiration, an ilham. And that's just for us. If you want to share it, that's okay. But the thing is that it is for your own use. In other words, you have not become a prophet in the sense of, I guess, the word prophet in English is a little limited. In Arabic, we have two words. We have the word Nabi and we have the word Rasul. Nabi is when a person receives wahya, that is an inspiration for all humanity. And in that sense, Muhammad is Khatamul Nabiyyin, or the last of the Nabi type prophets. Whereas Rasul would be anyone who is kind of assigned a duty, a responsibility to do something good for himself, herself, or for the humanity. And that will be Risala, not Nubuwa. Remember, Nubuwa was for a collective, Risala is for individual. And in the sense of Risala, any one of us can be a Rasul. You're a Rasul, I'm a Rasul. When we receive a mission, when we receive an inspiration to do something good, then we have been assigned that task individually. So Risalat has not ended. Only Nubuwat has ended. And so, yeah, we can teach and we can preach if we want to. But my point is that the best way to connect with the divine is by yourself. The minute you involve others, that's a different story. If someone asks you, how he or she should pray, if they ask for direction to the Kaaba, if they ask if there is a prayer rug or something, if people ask you, yes, of course you help them. But the point is, you don't start preaching especially if you are being judgmental, especially when you're assuming that the way this person is praying is not correct. Because that person is the shepherd, remember? And Moses, who was a prophet, was criticizing him, and God told him, no, you can't. You should not. I will accept my another humans, okay, my banda, my abids, the abid and mabud linkage. I will accept someone's prayer no matter how they do it, whether it's through silence, through prayers, ritual prayers, or whatever. But the problem with us humans is that we always think we are right. And our preaching is, in most cases, very condescending. We show our arrogance, our knowledge, our, all of that, because we think we are, if there's anyone right in the world, it's me. The rest of the people know a little bit. That's one thing when it comes to the, as they use the word, the distribution of wisdom. God gave everybody some wisdom, but God gave me all of it. That's the attitude we have. And because of that attitude, we feel obligated that then we must judge the action of people. We can't judge the action because faith is in one's heart. And nobody knows what is in somebody's heart except God Almighty. And that's why when people make this fatwa of kufr, that this person isn't kafir, that's not a Muslim, that's totally nonsense. That's shirk. Because they're putting themselves in the place of God. And because they are, in essence, claiming that they know what is in that person's heart, and so they have determined the person is not a person of faith. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'll go through the questions that we have from the audience. The first question that I'd like to pick from here is from Abdullah Ali Beg Mirza. He says, we shall refine our thinking and educate ourselves to be updated with new discoveries of the lovely deen. Please tell us, question number 1, the source of researched knowledge of Islam's findings. And 2, the question number 2, how can we collate all the research of Quran and updated centrally to be accessed universally with all its protection?
Why don't you ask a few more questions, and that way I can choose to answer the easier ones.
Sure. Then there's a question from Hasina Ahmadi from Afghanistan. She says, God is infinite and we are finite. We are not able to perceive God, so how can we communicate with God without any intervention? Is it really possible to be in the right path? If you like, I can also read out one more question to you.
I'm wishing for an easier one. Go ahead.
Okay. This is from Ibrahim. It says, how should we understand the verse Inna Dina Inda Lillahil Islam, as if you say God has no religion?
Okay. Yeah. Let me start with the last one. Deen or religion means way. Way is a path. A path implies going from point A to point B. God cannot have a path because God is everywhere. If you're going from point A to point B, you have a way, you need a road. But God is everywhere, so God doesn't need to go anywhere. So that's the philosophical approach, that there is no God. That there's no religion of God. The other argument is that when God makes reference to, yes, God made those reference to other people in their scriptures in pretty much the same way. And we Muslims are told to accept all of those. when we read at the end of Surah Baqarah, I think ayah 285, that we have to accept وَمَلَائِكَتِهِ وَكُتُوبِهِ وَرُسُولِهِ, when those are all said in plural, is that becomes part of our iman mujamal, our collective faith, is that we have to accept all of that, all of God's prophets, all of God's books. So you have already accepted all of them. So there is no monopoly. God has told you. Also, you can, I think it's ayah 63 of Surah Baqarah, where the precondition for reaching the divine is that people who accept God as one, not a mathematical number, but one totality for all existence, which I translate more as a cosmic totality of oneness. That is one condition. The other is that if you believe in the hereafter, and that implies that you have to accept the eternity of time, not the finality, the eternity. And then the third condition is that for people to do good. So again, go to ayah 63, Surah Baqarah, and it clearly tells you what the preconditions are. It doesn't tell you you have to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist or whatever. These are the conditions any faith, any religion that accepts this, that accepts the infinity and eternity of time and the oneness of one God for all existence, and to do good. God equals good. In most languages, those words are derived from one another. So if you do good, you're godly. And as they say in English, you're good, no problem. The question of the infinity of time, no, I think I forgot a little bit of it, that humans have both sides. We have a finite side, which is our physical, that we see dying every day. We die in the physical millions of times a day. Every cell that dies in our body is our physical death. And then we have the eternity, which is our soul, which comes from the Spirit of God. And in that case, we are eternal. The idea here is that you have to know which side you play on. Like on a piano, you can play on the black keys or on the white keys, right? That's just as a matter of putting it a little lighter, is that, yeah, you can think of yourself as the physical being and deny that you have the Spirit of God running through you. And there are a lot of people who just simply deny that, that there is God, or there is God's Spirit, or that there is God's Spirit in humans. And that's fine, not by me, it's fine by God. God has given them that choice. God has given humans the choice either to accept God or to reject God. So if God has given you that prerogative, who are we to get in there? The other question, I was a little, I was not very clear on that. It was, I think, making reference to accessing all information. Well, there is a problem. There is not a lack of knowledge, nor is there an absence of access to information. The important thing is acting upon whatever information you have. You don't have to be a philosopher. You don't have to become a great mufti or a jurist. But if you're walking in the street and if you see a human being or a cat or a bird or another living being that is in need of help, you help. That will make you godly. Doesn't matter how much philosophy you know. But if you don't translate it into an action, then it doesn't get anywhere. You could be a great philosopher, but then you're not a good human if you're, let's say, destroying nature or hurting animals or mistreating other human beings. Look at what was happening before the coronavirus, and it's still happening in many parts of the world. There's no shortage of knowledge. Remember, about 100 years ago, one of the excuses people used that why did the Nazis incinerate 6 million Jews is that, oh, but we didn't know. In our lifetime right now, through the social media, we know exactly what's happening to the Palestinians. But what do we do about it? Nothing. We know exactly what happens to the Uyghur people in Eastern Turkestan or to the people in Yemen and so on and so forth. So knowledge is there. The action is what is needed. I think I might have answered that question. So go ahead with the other ones.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now we have a question from Khairun Nisa. She says, am I right to say that today religion is a source of bigotry? How can that love for God be ignited within ourselves? What is role of following imams, awliya in this without falling into political aspect of it that is chauvinistic?
Okay. Islam's one of the good points, one of the virtues in Islam, in my opinion, is that it's a direct connection between the human and the divine. All the intermediaries are pushed aside. And so, therefore, there's no hierarchy. You talk to God when you want to, how you want to, in whatever language, whatever term you use. You don't need an intermediary to go to an awliya and to go to all these different people who have kind of, many of them, not necessarily all of them, many of them have assigned themselves as the deputies of God on earth. There is no deputy. God created Adam and said, Inna ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. Adam is Khalifa. Adam is the deputy of God. Back to the allegory. You're Adam. You're God's Khalifa. You're God's vicegerent on earth. You have every right and you have every obligation that you have. It's between you and God. And that's why when she is saying that religion becomes bigotry, that's what I referred to earlier. Because we do most of the things we do in the name of religion, we do it for the society, either because the society is pressuring us or because we are responding to those pressures. And the extreme cases might be in certain governments when the police come after you and they beat you because it's the time for prayer and you're not praying. Now, in this case, God is so marginalized that it doesn't matter. I'm sorry to put it that way. What matters is that if the piety police, let's say in Saudi Arabia, comes and tells you it's time for prayer, and if you don't, they will beat you up, or in some other countries, or all the wonderful things we do to people who are not fasting. This would be the most relevant thing to our discussion. That I had a list somewhere. There are places where they will put you in jail for 2-3 years and fine you a large sums of money and beat you in public, humiliate you, all these things because you're not fasting. That is the clearest example of this bigotry. And yes, it's sold in the name of Islam, and that's the most unfortunate thing. Who are you to tell me that you have the right to come between me and God? Who are you to tell me that you know from my heart? Who are you to tell me that you have already determined that I was not fasting because I was violating a certain law and that I did not have a reason for it? That I may be sick, that I might have diabetes, I might have certain other conditions. And so these are the things where she is putting it squarely, that it's the greatest bigotry and it's unfortunate.
Thank you. we have this final question from Irshad Khan. The question is, you have mentioned purification in human is inevitable. How can this purification process lead to individual freedom and self-development in human behavior?
I don't know if I got the point, but yes, there was reference to self-purification. The idea here is that it would lead to your independence because you will be detached from the material and you will be attached and connected to the divine. And I think, if I can recall, there was a story of a great Sufi master somewhere in India. A certain prince heard that there was this significant Sufi, that everybody was going there and all that. And so he said, well, if everybody's going, I'm going there too. You know how rulers and politicians do things for the sake of people. And so he said, well, because I'm a prince and I have a lot of wealth and money and gold and jewel, I'm not going to go empty-handed. So he, loaded a number of camels or maybe elephants with all the wealth that he could show off, and he took that. And when he reached the place of the great sheikh, he was expecting to be treated royally, and people should make way for him, that he should go first. And he was told to stand in line like everybody else. And when he reached the Sufi sheikh, and he told him, look, I brought you all of this. And the sheikh said, you didn't. When you want to come and see me, you come without that. You have brought that to show off. Well, probably he didn't say that second part of it. So the man went and took everything and gave it to the poor, all the wealth and jewel and whatever he had gathered. And next time he walked like everybody else. He waited in line. And when he came, the sheikh stood in front of him and said, now you have come to see me. So in that case, yeah, a lot of these, our attachment to material wealth has that seductive element to it. It makes us feel good to be rich and to be wealthy, to be powerful, to have high stature. Look at what's happening to many of these huge bigots as leaders of the different countries. I won't name any, but I'm sure you get it.
So thank you very much, Dr. Zaman, for joining us today. It really attracted a lot of audience and questions from them. We look forward to seeing you at some other platform where we can have another interaction and discussion with you.
Well, thank you so much. I don't know if your time is restricted. That is your prerogative, but I still have time for, yeah, I mean.
Yes, we.
But if
right.
your limitations are demanding it, then we'll stop here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to see your wonderful friends. And I thank them for joining us, not only from India, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, but those who live here in the United States and Canada this late at night. I'm sure it's very inconvenient. It's nice of them to join us, and I'm thanking them and appreciating that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And Ramadan Mubarak to everyone. Thanks. Bye.